Hello, today I'm talking about a pretty random book, Lost in the Wild by Cary Griffith. I bought it on a whim, basically at a small local bookshop in Grand Marais, Minnesota, mostly as a souvenir. I was doing a little trip up there and I wanted something relevant to the area in some way. And the synopsis seemed interesting enough. It's basically like a written version of an episode of I Survived or I Shouldn't Be Alive or something like that if you've seen those shows. In the case of this book, it's actually two different real-life true survival stories being told at once, switching off every other chapter, both following a different young man as he gets lost in the Northwoods/Boundary Waters area of southern Ontario and northern Minnesota. One is about this guy named Dan Stevens, who is this very experienced outdoorsman type, and he's leading a troop of teenage scouts from Chattanooga and two of their fathers through various portages up a chain of lakes in southern Ontario called the Man Chain. Things go a little bit awry for Dan Stevens when he's exploring some part of the woods and he falls off a rock and hits his head and concusses himself. And when he awakens, he's so disoriented that he kind of just wanders deeper into the woods and gets himself even more lost and separated from the group that he's with. This scout troop and their fathers grow pretty quickly concerned when Dan Stevens does not emerge from the woods, so they decide that they're gonna not sit around, they're gonna go try to get help, so they get together and they start the portaging backwards the way they came. I thought the Dan Stevens story was quite handily the least interesting of the two stories. The most intense part was definitely right after Dan Stevens gets lost and these unexperienced scouts and their fathers have to navigate their way back to the base camp by themselves. No doubt a difficult and daunting task without their expert leader, but they ultimately reach help with little issue. Furthermore, Dan Stevens is a wilderness expert to such a degree that at no point during the story did I ever feel worried for him or for his safety. He had no trouble surviving in the woods for the few days that he was lost, besides having some pretty torn up legs from bug bites and maybe some mild dehydration. He was pretty much completely fine. It just wasn't that interesting of a story to me overall, and also there was this weird recurring admonition of the Chattanooga group for going back for help instead of waiting there for Dan Stevens to return. What were they supposed to do? Just sit there and starve? I mean, Dan didn't even end up returning to the place where they were anyway. In fact, he got out completely without their help regardless. So, I don't know, just kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and on top of that, the story just didn't really have that high of stakes. But the other story in here was far more interesting to me. It follows around this guy named Jason Rasmussen. He's a college student who's attempting to hike the Powwow Trail in the Boundary Waters of northern Minnesota. The key differences between the Jason Rasmussen story and the Dan Stevens story is, for one, Jason Rasmussen has decided to do this multi-day hike completely alone. Two, it's happening in late October as opposed to the summer like the other story, and the cold weather ends up becoming a pretty major factor in this whole story. And three, and most importantly, I think, is that Jason Rasmussen is just a far less experienced outdoorsman. It's really more of just a hobby to him as opposed to a lifestyle like it was for Dan Stevens. At least that's how it came across to me. And although he did go into the hike relatively prepared, I would say, it just was not enough to help him through some of his pretty questionable decision making, in my opinion. He gets lost pretty much right away when an old logging road that veers off the Powwow Trail lures him into the wrong direction, which, fair enough. Even later on, when they're conducting the rescue mission, some of the rescue personnel get lured off this exact same path, so I can't really blame him for that part. So after a day of wandering deeper in the middle of nowhere, he sort of begins to realize he doesn't really know where he is, so he just sets up camp at some random lake he stumbled across. Even though he's kind of already lost at this point, he still thinks he's on the correct path somewhere. So when he's consulting his map later that night, he incorrectly identifies this lake that he thinks he's on, and this lake just so happens to be a couple miles north of the road he came in on. He then proceeds to abandon his tent and all his equipment and just hike due south, thinking that he's going to encounter this road, which, by the way, this is a cosmically bad move. Even if you're somewhat confident that you know where you are, you just should not do that, I think. Is that obvious? I don't know. I feel like even me, who knows nothing about wilderness survival, would not do this, but I don't know. Maybe it's different in the moment. But yeah, he basically just wanders even deeper into the woods, and then now he's lost again. He's lost from the trail, like he was originally, and now he's also lost from his tent and all his equipment, so he's just doubly lost, literally in the middle of nowhere, in the woods, miles and miles away from any civilization. He also realizes that at some point he lost the map, which, I mean, I don't think that would have helped him that much considering how far off the trail he was. But on top of that even, it also has now started to snow. So he's forced to take shelter in the husk of this fallen tree, where he then resides for 6 days until he is rescued, suffering from extreme hypothermia, probably literally just on the brink of death. So yeah, I thought of the two stories, that one was far and away more intense, more interesting, more scary, because to me the situation was just orders of magnitude more dire. Jason was more lost with less experience and in worse conditions, sitting in a frozen tree with literally nothing but his body heat and a water bottle he was using to melt snow in so that he could drink water. Just an extremely intense survival experience that is told very vividly, up to and including Jason's very sad and very stark ruminations on his own impending death. I will say the ending section of both stories was a little bit hard to follow, as you're basically inundated with like 100 different rescue personnel characters setting up similarly complicated plans to extract their respective men lost in the wild, especially since these stories were being told concurrently, so you're reading both rescue missions at once, and it just got confusing keeping track of all these new names and like, is this guy with the Dan Stevens story or is this guy with the Jason Rasmussen story? It was just kind of jumbled a little bit. But as a whole, this book is solid. I think the narrativized nonfiction thing works really well here. It was cool being able to be inside the heads of the guys who were lost, as opposed to reading about their experiences in a more impersonal way. I think the book just does a really good job of showing how unforgiving nature is, regardless of how experienced you are. You either respect it or you will die at the bottom of a bog. So yeah, I'm gonna give this book 7 Minnesotas out of 10.